Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Grossman. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. We are excited to be discussing broadband deployment and access in Michigan, an issue that's only become more important in the last few years. A couple of reminders. IPPSR does also run the Michigan Political Leadership Program, and this is our application deadline week. So if you are considering a future career in Michigan politics, please consider applying for MPLP. Our next forum will be on October 19th at noon. We're going to cover each of the ballot propositions on the November ballot. And then on November 15th, we will have a hopefully in-person session at the Capitol to review the election results. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for one or both of those future forums. And if you want to hear from us more often, we also have a State of the State podcast where we talk more about Michigan policy and have guests each month. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Arnold Weinfeld, our Associate Director, who will be moderating today's session.
Thanks, Matt. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us today. We think we've got a great program to cover recent initiatives announced regarding broadband across the state of Michigan. And to join us today, we have Eric Frederick, who serves as the state of Michigan's first chief connectivity officer, leading the Michigan High-Speed Internet Office, with the goals of achieving universal broadband access and creating a more digitally equitable state. Mr. Frederick is a state and community broadband policy and planning expert and has had long-term and comprehensive work in the area of broadband and broadband planning, having previously served as executive director for Connected Nation Michigan. Our second presenters are going to be Dr. Johannes Bauer of Michigan State University's Quello Center. Dr. Bauer is the Quello Chair for Media and Information Policy at the center. He previously served as chairperson of the Department of Media and Information. Much of his research centers on policy issues, such as the design of policy and regulation for advanced media and the internet, cybersecurity, innovation in the digital economy. And also joining us will be Joe Sawaski. Joe is currently the president and CEO of Merit Network, a nonprofit corporation governed by Michigan's public universities. Merit was started in 1966 and has become a shared resource to help meet common need for advanced networking amongst Michigan's public universities. Today, Merit provides high-performance networking, cybersecurity solutions, and community building services to nearly 400 higher education, K-12, library, governmental, community, and healthcare organizations, among others. And if you're not familiar with Network, you certainly should be, and hopefully will be by the time we finish. A couple of housekeeping things. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as we move along and at the end of the session. All attendees are muted and not able to raise their hand because of the size of the audience we have today. So again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. And with that, I'd like to welcome Eric Frederick. Eric, I believe you're up first.
All right, thanks, Arnold. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let me know if you can see that okay.
Sure can.
All right, thanks. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's certainly an honor to be here with this group. I've spoken with these gentlemen a number of times in the past, but it's always good to get back together and really dive into a topic that I'm passionate about. So like Arnold said, I'm Eric Frederick. I'm the Chief Connectivity Officer for the state of Michigan with the Michigan High-Speed Internet Office. And I want to talk to this group today and give a little bit of an overview of the MiHi office, who we are, what we do, and the goals that we're trying to achieve. I want to talk about our mission, our framework, and our principles. So I want to make sure that there's a solid understanding of the higher level principles that are driving our work as an office. There's a lot to be done in this space in the next couple of years, and so starting with that solid mission, goals, framework, and principles is going to be really good for everyone to understand how we're approaching this work to achieve the universal broadband connectivity in Michigan. I'll then talk more specifically about the programs that we're going to be implementing, and of course some immediate next steps. So like I said, the Michigan High-Speed Internet Office is the state's single point of contact for all things broadband in Michigan. We are located within the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity in the Prosperity Division there, which is a great place to be in because there's so many various programs that LEO hosts that are great touch points for broadband. Broadband impacts everything, so we want to make sure that we're plugged into the best spot within state government to really be able to impact the connectivity and really identify those challenges across state government. And LEO is a great place to do that. The Michigan High-Speed Internet Office was created by executive directive of the governor in June of 2021, but was not authorized to bring on staff or have funding until April of 2022 with the passage and signing of the Building Michigan Together plan. So that plan gave us the authorization to bring on staff to start building this capacity to address broadband within state government earlier this year. So eventually, our office will have a staff of 8. Currently, we have 3. Myself, our digital equity director, Ali Herkenroder, who comes from Flint, and being a very boots on the ground digital inclusion practitioner, helping the Flint Housing Commission with connectivity there. We have our executive assistant on board, Leslie McCarrick, and then we're adding a number of positions here in our office in the near future to help us again build that capacity for addressing all of the challenges that the state faces in terms of broadband and connectivity. So we'll be onboarding more staff here very shortly, and in a little bit when I talk about the programs we'll be implementing, you'll see why the staff is going to be absolutely necessary. So again, I want to start at the high level about MyHigh and what we're looking to do, and then bring it down to the programs that we're going to implement to get this job done. So our mission at MyHigh is to create a more digitally equitable state where everyone can leverage technology to improve their quality of life, full stop. We know that technology is a tool. We know that broadband is a tool, it's a resource, and it's absolutely critical to improve your quality of life, whether we're talking about access to healthcare or education or government services, or to the economy or participation in society in general. We know that broadband is a tool. And so our mission is to leverage that technology to improve quality of life. And the way we're going to measure ourselves in achieving that mission is through 2 primary goals. The first is to ensure universal availability of broadband to every home, business, institution, and community. So that's ensuring that there is a connection available to every location in the state. Our second goal is to ensure that 95% of households adopt a permanent broadband connection at home. Not smartphone only, not having to go to a library to access the internet, that they are able to adopt that connection at home. Now that number is not 100% because we don't want to force folks to have the internet at home if they don't want it, but making sure that we've addressed issues of affordability and access to devices and digital literacy and cyber safety and all of the other components of the digital divide helps ensure that households can actually adopt that permanent connection once it's been made available to them. So these 2 goals are aggressive, but they are what's needed to make sure that Michigan stands out in our economy, in society, and as a place that people want to be because this connectivity is there. And so those are our 2 goals that will help us identify whether we're achieving our mission or not. One of the things I like to do is try to identify and inform folks of the framework through which we're going to do all of our work. And so I use a lot of terms that may or may not be everyday household terms for folks that are in the broadband policy space. So I want to just make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I use a term like digital equity is our goal. Digital equity is a state when everyone has the ability to leverage technology to improve their quality of life. Again, our mission as an organization. So digital equity is the goal. The digital divide then is the issue. I've heard folks have referred to this as the digital chasm, and in some cases that's probably true for a lot of folks. So the digital divide is the problem. In Michigan, we have about a third of households that struggle with some form of the digital divide, whether the infrastructure is not available to them. If it is available, they can't afford it. They don't have a device to connect to it. They don't have the skills to be able to use that device to connect to it. And so about a third of households are struggling with one or more forms of the digital divide, and that is our issue as a state. And then finally, digital inclusion then is the work that we do to overcome the issue and get to our goal. So it's all of the things that we do, whether it's us doing them, it's a library that's doing them in a community, it's a nonprofit organization, whatever it is, digital inclusion is the work. So I just want to make those terms very clear as we start to set out on our work as an office. And digital inclusion work includes kind of elements, these 5 elements. So it's affordable, robust broadband internet service, having internet-enabled devices, addressing digital literacy, access to quality technical support, and then of course, all of the applications and online content that are designed to improve our quality of life. So when we talk about digital inclusion work, it's work that addresses one or more of those 5 specific areas, again, to overcome the divide and reach our goal of digital equity. So I just want to make sure we're kind of on the same page as far as the terminology goes. So all of our work at the MyHigh office is going to be done through that lens of digital equity and digital inclusion. But we also have some other underlying guiding principles that I think are going to be really important to our program implementation. And I'm going to go over those programs here in a second. But again, setting that stage of the principles and the framework through which we're going to operate at MyHigh, I think is really critical. And those 3 guiding principles are creativity, efficiency, and transparency. Obviously, the problem of the digital divide has not been solved yet. And so we need new models and new ways of doing things and new policies to get creative about how we're going to solve this challenge. That means making sure that we have every tool in our toolbox and every seat at that table filled with those who are struggling with the divide to make sure we're addressing those needs. And that's where that creativity piece comes in. We don't have all the answers. We need to go out and find those answers and develop new ways of doing things. And we want to be creative about doing that. Secondly, we need to be efficient. As you'll see in a moment, there are lots of resources coming to solve this problem. More so than has ever been available from the federal government before, but we still need to be efficient with how those dollars are spent. We need to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, we're not siloing efforts. We want to make sure that we're sharing information across agencies, across communities, to really make the funding decisions that need to be made efficiently, so that we can spread that federal dollar as far as we possibly can to ensure that we meet our goals. And ladders up to our mission. And that really also speaks to transparency. We want to make sure that federal funds are spent wisely, and that we are good stewards of those funds. And so there's really 2 levels of transparency here. One is our responsibility to the federal government, who is providing the state with the funds to operate these programs that I'll talk about here in a second. So we need to be transparent about how those funds are spent. But so too then transparent to all Michiganders across our state, in that making sure funds that are spent from our office to build infrastructure, because a lot of our funds are going to be spent as a sub-grant program, I'll talk about here in a second. We need to make sure that those funds are used in a way to fulfill the promises that were made when those funds were awarded. For a long time, the federal government has been accused of not validating whether broadband funds have been spent in a way that was truly designed to deliver the speeds and the product that users were expecting. And so we don't want to repeat that mistake. We want to make sure that we are validating grant builds and validating the services that are delivered to make sure that those funds were spent wisely, and that the services that were promised are the services that are delivered. So the MyHigh office is going to be responsible for implementing 3 primary programs. One is called the Robin program, the Realizing Opportunity with Broadband Infrastructure Networks. There's a lot of acronyms here, but I think Robin is one of my favorites so far. The Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and the State Digital Equity Planning and Capacity Grant Programs. So I'll go through each of those here very briefly. The Robin program is a very traditional last mile and middle mile grant program. This is funded with $250 million from the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund that was included in the American Rescue Plan that passed last year. And this will be implemented as a sub-grant. where grantee or potential grantees would come to the program, apply to serve an unserved part of the state, and funds would be awarded to build out into those areas. The definition of unserved here is 100 by 20 megabits per second, a speed that is on par with the speeds that were defined in the infrastructure law, and as well as, again, at the state level with the creation of this new program. The funds are administered by the U.S. Treasury, and within the next week or so, we should see an announcement from U.S. Treasury on the award of these funds for the state, but yet to be confirmed. We want to get this program as an office up and running sooner than later, so I'm looking to have an application window open for this program by early winter. And again, this program is really going to kickstart the broadband efforts in Michigan in a very big way, and by weaving together the funding from this program with the program funding that's coming from BEAD, which I'll talk about here in a second, we're going to be making, again, efficient decisions about where these funds need to be spent to solve our connectivity challenges. The BEAD program is the largest source of broadband funding that has ever been available from the federal government, and will likely be available from the federal government for generations to come. This program prioritizes building new networks to areas that are unserved and underserved across the state, as well as to community anchor institutions. And while final allocation decisions have not yet been made, Michigan is expected to receive anywhere from $1.5 to $1.7 billion in this program. That's a lot of network that can be built. And again, this is going to be done as a sub-grant process. That's the way it was designed in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so many different entity types will be eligible for this funding, including private ISPs, nonprofits, communities, cooperatives, you name it. They're going to be allowed to participate. And that's where that creativity piece comes in. We need to start looking at new models and ways of doing things, and finding the best creative and efficient solution to build out broadband to our unserved and underserved areas. This process begins with some very robust planning that'll kick off later this fall. So stay tuned for more information on those planning efforts. But the funds are not likely to start flowing until early 2024. And that's because, again, not only does it start with robust planning, but there's a lot of federal pieces that need to be put in place before these funds can start rolling out. But early 2024 is when I expect those funds to be able to start rolling out for infrastructure construction. And then finally, the program that doesn't get nearly as much attention because the funding isn't quite as large, but I think is actually even more important, is the state digital equity planning and capacity grants. So these are programs designed to address the other aspects of the digital divide other than infrastructure. So programs that are planning for and implementing programs that are designed to address affordability, access to devices, digital literacy, cyber safety, technical support, and application development are what the digital equity planning and capacity grants are designed to do. So again, this starts with robust planning to create a digital equity plan for the state and address the needs of what are called covered populations. So we want to be able to hear from rural residents, aging individuals, low-income households, veterans, those with disabilities, those with a language barrier, members of racial and ethnic minority groups, and incarcerated individuals, and make sure we're accounting for their needs in this plan as directed by the bipartisan infrastructure law. So again, this starts with planning, and then next year the state will get a formula-based allocation of funds to then implement the plan that we create to address the digital divide needs of these groups. So like I said, I want to cover the planning effort here that's going to start soon. This fall, we'll be embarking on this comprehensive and robust statewide planning effort. We are required, just like the federal government, we are required to create a plan for one program and a plan for the other. But again, we're trying to prevent siloing and being more efficient with our funds. So we are combining those planning efforts into one and creating what we're calling My Connected Future. And this is the name that we're giving to this planning effort. So we'll be going out and meeting with communities in every corner of the state, listening to what their needs are, listening to our stakeholders about how these programs should be designed, specifically the BEAD program and the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. How do we address this challenge? How do we get creative and more efficient with how we build out infrastructure? How can we be transparent and make sure that those that are receiving grants are accountable for the grants that they receive and connecting all of our state? So this planning effort is going to help us answer a lot of questions and develop programs that are best for Michigan and its communities to achieve our goals. So finally, some of the immediate next steps that we are, as an office, are implementing Securing that initial federal funding is really key. That should happen in the next several weeks to make sure we have the funding as an office to really start going out and putting all of these pieces in place that need to be there to support the grant programs that are coming. Onboarding additional staff, like I said, will eventually be an office of 8. There's currently 3 of us. So bringing on additional staff to build that capacity is really necessary. We'll be building out a detailed engagement strategy for the My Connected Future plan. So again, look for more information on that here in the near future. We're going to complete a project that currently started. It started back in February, called the Infrastructure Asset Audit Project. And this is something that's going to really help us better understand where broadband availability is and is not, so that we can make sure that federal maps of broadband infrastructure, as well as our state maps, are as accurate as possible. So we know, again, efficiently where those funds need to be spent and where they don't. So that's going to be an effort that'll strongly help that decision making. And then, just like I said before, we want to get the $250 million Robin program up and running as soon as possible. And so we'll be developing the scoring rubric and the application and all the materials that go into administering a grant here in the very near future, and opening that up for applications here in early winter. So I know I covered a lot. Arnold, again, thank you for that opportunity. And then we can either take questions at the end or now, however you'd like to do it.
Thanks, Eric. Greatly appreciated. Very exciting, especially given the funding that will be coming to Michigan. I know you've been working in this area a long time, as have many of us. We do have one question that I'll pose right now. It's from Richard Lang. With Robin coming very soon, how can service providers be aligned now with a digital equity and inclusion program with state initiatives?
That's a really good question. So a couple benchmarks for the Robin program were included in the legislation that created it from the state level, but also in U.S. Treasury's guidance for the Capital Projects Fund. One is making sure that any proposed networks be built out to areas that are underserved by infrastructure at 100 by 20 megabits per second. So those are the target areas for that program from an ISP perspective. And then 2, any participant in the Robin program has to be a participant in what's called the Affordable Connectivity Program. And that is a subsidy program that's run by the FCC that provides a $30 per month discount on internet service for eligible households. And the eligibility is quite large, but the main eligibility criteria is 200% of federal poverty level. There's a number of other ones as well, but that's the main one. And so that's one big way that U.S. Treasury and the federal government is ensuring that we're addressing that digital equity and inclusion piece, is participation in that affordability program. But there's certainly other things that potential applicants could do for the Robin program. And while we're still defining all the rules and guidelines for that program, I'm thinking of ways that we've seen it done in the past, where ISPs have partnered with a local library to help provide digital literacy training, or where they've partnered with a local nonprofit to help develop a device refurbishment program, for example, and get devices out to those that might need them, or partnered with a school to do the same thing. So I think there's a lot of creativity that can happen on that digital equity and inclusion side. But from a programmatic standpoint, at least right now, we know that participation in that Affordable Connectivity Program is going to be required because that's a guideline from U.S. Treasury. But certainly looking at ways to partner with communities that you're proposing to serve, and looking at those who are doing digital equity and inclusion work there, and finding some synergies on the ground, I think will be a really key way to ensuring that we're addressing both the infrastructure as well as the equity and inclusion side of the scales.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. There was extensive boilerplate conditions on the state appropriation for the Robin program. Do any state stipulations conflict with federal guidelines? And if so, what conflicts exist and how will you navigate these?
So you're right. The only conflict there really was, and it's not a direct conflict, because the state legislation allows for supporting faster networks, was the definition of broadband at 100 by 20 megabits per second. U.S. Treasury guidance for the Capital Projects Fund wants to see projects built that provide 100 by 100 megabits per second, so symmetrical broadband service of at least 100 megabits per second. The legislation, the boilerplate language that created Robin, allows for networks that are built at 100 by 20 megabits per second, but does recognize that faster networks should be prioritized. And so we've been working with Treasury to ensure that not only their guidelines are met, but the boilerplate language as well. And so there is kind of a coming together, a reckoning, if you will, of those two levels of guidance. But we will be able to ensure that both of those requirements are met as we start to build out that program.
One more question, and then we'll move on and continue to take questions along the way and at the end. Migrant farm workers are not an explicit eligible category in the Federal Digital Equity Act. Do you have any plans to include them and labor camp housing?
I think that's a fantastic question. So in the BEAD program, states are allowed to define community anchor institutions and other populations that need to be addressed. They have that flexibility to add some definition to that. And so I think that is something that we do need to explore, since we are such a large agricultural state, making sure that there are facilities and connectivity available for the migrant population, I think, is really key. It's one place that I've been working with the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development on for a while, is trying to identify connectivity needs for some of the facilities across the state. But I think that'll be a key group to include and make sure we're considering as we start building out these plans.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. Well, please continue to put questions in that Q&A box, and we'll get to them after the next presentation for sure. And with that, I'd like to introduce Joe Sawatsky with the Merit Network, who actually tells us he's been experiencing some issues today, so may fade in and out on us. And Dr. Johannes Bauer with the Quello Center at MSU. Both of them are working collaboratively on various broadband initiatives. Joe?
Thank you, Arnold. And actually, we're going to have Johannes kick us off today. We're going to switch it up a little bit. So Johannes, would you like to begin?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Arnold and Matt, for the invitation, for the opportunity to be with this group. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a great pleasure to follow Eric, who has done really wonderful work in the state. I really appreciate sort of his 360-degree vision of what needs to be done to improve the state of broadband connectivity. Let me quickly now share my screen here. And I will carry about half the presentation, and then Joe will come in. And go to presentation mode. As Arnold said, Michigan State University and Merit Network have worked for a long time. In fact, Michigan State University, the University of Michigan, and Wayne State University were the founding members of Merit in the 1960s, and Joe will say more about this. But the Quello Center, with whom I'm affiliated, is a research and outreach center and has done work with Merit over the years on wireless issues, and most recently in the last 3, 4, 5 years even on digital inequality and digital inclusion. To give a little bit of a background on the center, which you may or may not know, it's named after James Quello, who was an MSU alumnus, and from 1974 until 1997 served as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. He's the second longest serving commissioner in that agency. He was actually appointed by Richard Nixon as a conservative Democrat to a seat that had a Democratic tag attached to it at the Federal Communications Commission, and was reappointed by subsequent Democratic and Republican administrations. Jim was a bridge builder, actually, one of those rare individuals who actually was able to work across the aisles and find workable solutions. And our center tries to cultivate that tradition. So we are, on the one hand, a highbrow research institute who has, we have our heads in highly theoretical and conceptual research, but we also have a leg on the ground working with people in communities and in other places to translate this work into actionable and workable policies. The center currently has a number of affiliates, and I don't have to go into this, in the US and in other places. Our research is organized around a few research clusters. Broadband, digital equity, and inclusion is one big one and has actually grown over the past few years. But we also work more generally on the social impacts of information technology and new media. For example, we have these huge discussions going on this, whether social media mitigate mental health issues or whether they aggravate mental health issues. We have done work along those lines. We do a lot of work on digital innovation and transformation. In fact, I'm right now sitting at a conference room at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., who invited me to give a talk on these issues a little bit later this afternoon. We have workshops, we have policy briefs, lectures, panels, and I invite you to check out our website, our publications, and sign up for our newsletter and our updates if you're interested in listening to some of those talks. Eric already mentioned, of course, many of the background information. So let me say one or two things about broadband. Broadband is actually a family of technologies. There's no real good definition of what broadband means, right? I mean, we currently 25 megabits per second download is considered broadband and 3 megabits upload. But that is just in a sense, it's a temporary number, right? We started initially, broadband was considered 200 megabits per second download. And currently the discussion in the US is already moving up to 120. The best view of broadband in my view is this. Broadband is a level of connectivity where the existing support that the network provides does not limit users from using the most current and most leading edge applications at this point in time. So that's a flexible threshold, right? It will over time likely go up. But there's another view that we can have, and that is broadband could also be seen as a technology that does not prevent innovators from moving to the next step of innovations, right? So that's a more challenging threshold. We can achieve such connectivity with multiple technologies, both wireless and wireline. The technology of choice in many of the federal programs currently is fixed line technology, mostly fiber where possible, because that's very scalable and meets those forward-looking goals more and better than others. But we could also envision 5G. Now, one challenge, of course, of fiber and 5G technology is that they're both technologies that have very, very high upfront investment cost, and then they have lower operations and maintenance costs once they're in place. Right? The same is not necessarily true for earlier generations of mobile. In Michigan, as Eric alluded to, there's considerable gaps in connectivity. And without going into the details here, this is a map that was actually created by Connected Nation, the organization that Eric headed before he joined MyHigh. What you see here is that dark areas are sort of areas where there are more households who do not have connectivity that is capable of supporting 100 megabit per second download and 10 upload. And so the main message to take away is really that the gaps that exist in connectivity are very unevenly distributed in Michigan. Not surprisingly, they are higher in more rural areas. And we could have similar maps that look at the affordability gaps and discrepancies that we see. Now, the main point I want to make, though, is that these discrepancies, they are not just discrepancies in access to a technological support network, but they really have wide social repercussions. So we need to be concerned about those, not only as technologists and as people worried about infrastructure, but really as citizens who care about the present and the future of the next generation. And so what I would like to share with you in the next couple of slides in a few moments are insights from a study we did literally right before the pandemic on how broadband discrepancies affect educational outcomes. The term at the time was the homework gap. We didn't really think that the notion of a homework gap captured everything, and you'll see that this is actually not the case. It's part of the equation, but it's not all. And so what we found then, and I should say, and I'll come back to this, that we have updated this study this spring. We collected data again from about half the same sample population and then half new individuals. And we haven't fully analyzed the data, but we see some improvements and then we see other new questions arise. But in 2019, early 2020, here's the picture that we saw, that there's clearly a gap between those who household students, K through 12 students who reside in suburban settings and those who reside in rural areas. The sample population here, I should say, is 3 intermediate school districts, one in the Upper Peninsula, one north of Detroit, and then one in the rest of the state. And it's based on about 3,650 highly detailed individual surveys. They're all de-identified, so we don't know who the individuals are, but we have individual level data. And so here's what we see when we filter out all the other factors that are in play, right? So for example, the income level of a family has an impact, of course, on education outcomes. The education level of the family has an impact, but we statistically are able, because we have such a large sample, to control for all these variables. And here's what we see, kind of the net impact, if you wish, of variations in broadband connectivity on educational outcomes. Here on the left, on the right-hand side, you see the effect on GPAs, and you see that there's a gap of about half a grade point between those who are worst and those who have fast broadband access. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, students who have cell phone access only are actually the worst off, almost as bad off as those with no, worse off actually than those that have no access. This is not students who use their cell phone as a hotspot, but these are students who only have a mobile phone, right? Where you literally make your homework assignments based on your smartphone. And the affordances of these devices and other things such as probably wireless plans and so forth put limitations on how well and how effective these levels of connectivity are for grades outcomes. We also see that these students rank low on standardized tests. So for example, the SAT, PSAT tests, those students typically do worse than others. Secondly, and this is now where the ripple effects start to show, right? We see that these students also have very different career outlooks. Again, this is the net effect of variation in broadband connectivity. Students who have higher access, for example, more often envision going on to post-secondary types of education. They are more likely to envision STEM-related careers, and both are really strategies for the continuation of their lives that are more robust for the changes that we have in our high-tech economy. We know that STEM-related careers, for example, on average pay higher salaries and wages. They are sort of more robust for future developments. And therefore, that this interest in those careers is actually really a warning sign. So this is just an example. The good news from our latest study is actually that those gaps that we initially identified declined during the pandemic, right? So all these efforts from volunteers to businesses to government programs to schools and so forth that helped improve connectivity, some very, very innovative and creative, actually had a positive effect on the level of the disconnected ones, which shrunk. It did not completely eliminate the discrepancies in outcomes, right? So there's more in play, as Eric said. And what I'd like to do in the next few slides is just show you that access is only the first layer of the problem that we need to address, right? So in order to really move forward and address or harness the opportunities that digital technology offers to us, we need to think about digital equity and inclusion more from a systemic perspective. And that sounds really theoretical, but let me illustrate it, right? So essentially we know from research, our research, the research of many others, that the digital divide and related digital discrepancies have actually multiple levels. The lowest level, the first level of the digital divide, is access to the network and to devices. Without the network, nothing else happens, right? Unless we have access to a network and to devices to support innovative services, solutions in education, healthcare, elderly care, and so forth, we will not be able to utilize those. We also need, as Eric emphasized, a population that has the digital skills and the literacy necessary to use these technologies. This includes, the skills to use the technology, but it also includes awareness about cybersecurity threats and so forth. It includes the capability to utilize these technologies really effectively. It doesn't end there, right? I mean, if we also find a framework, maybe by changing our curricula, by working with businesses to think about technology solutions differently. We can also influence uses and outcomes, and the benefits really to a large degree depend on how well we think about outcomes. Let me give you an example. Many banks currently move to fintech solutions where you put all your bank transactions, let's say, on a mobile phones. And there's numerous examples in the United States and abroad where, in the best of all interests to innovate and to save costs and provide more flexibility, moving to a cell phone supported banking solution excludes people who are differently abled, who may have motor skill issues, may have visibility issues. And unless we apply and create a culture where we use a human-centric perspective to develop technological solutions, we may actually inadvertently exclude again. And so it's at this very unique moment, right? It's important to keep those broader, these third level digital inequality issues in mind. And finally, technology will not stop, right? We already speak about the next generation of technologies in the metaverse. We already have seen, right, a big change from the first generation internet that many of us grew up with to the second generation internet to one that is largely mobile and app driven. And we'll see another change to an internet that is based more on virtual reality technologies. The framework, the technology that is used in many of those applications is actually very different. It's based on gaming platforms and virtual reality development platforms. And to use these environments effectively will require new skills. So we need to make sure that as we talk in the second level of digital divides, as we train those skills and literacy, that we also make sure that individuals are able to adapt over time. And that is challenging, right? We need upskilling in the work place. But we have an increasingly aging population. We will need lifelong education that is not just a K through 12 or K through 20 education model, but maybe it's a K through 60 or K through 70, K through 80 model. And we haven't really found the solutions to this. And so let me just make a shameless plug to close here for the resources that Michigan State University can offer you and the state and Eric to help with this. We don't have answers with this, so we have contributions to answers. I think we have a lot of resources and capabilities that can help co-create answers to those questions that we are facing. And that could be in the area of planning and capacity building for local communities. For example, John Melchel, Rex Lamore, the Center for Community and Economic Development, and our extension program would be great resources. It could be related to network and device access. We and Merit have done a lot of work that Joe will talk about. We have a highly capable center that does remote sensing and geographic mapping. We could maybe, as MSU or together with other research universities in the state, we could become a trusted data repository for many of the planning data that we want to have access to. There's a public interest to have this data in the public domain. We have numerous units that can help develop those digital skills. The K through 12 outreach and engagement program in our College of Education, for example, works with schools to update the pedagogy and the curricula to a digital age so that we can effectively take advantage of the power of these technologies. It's not just putting your classroom on the Google Drive, right? That alone does not really harness the full benefits of digital education. And I saw Brian Beverly actually in the audience, who is spearheading that operation in the College of Education. We can help with users and outcomes. We have many technology development operations. For example, we work on mobile technology. Some of our team works on a digital health corridor where we help hospitals and individual healthcare providers to use telehealth and the burgeoning software that comes to the telehealth market more effectively. And finally, we have units that specialize on human-centric computing. For example, our Rural Computing and Research Consortium that works with people on the ground, goes to communities, goes to individual users to help contribute to what Eric said, right? Find out what it is that really people, individuals need, organizations need to achieve their tasks more effectively. more efficiently and preserve these great innovation spaces that digital technology has. So with this, I think I'll pass it over to Joe. Hopefully his connection is good enough to continue.
All right, thank you for that, Johannes. And I will apologize in advance. I rarely have internet problems up here in Charlevoix, Michigan. My internet is provided through the miracle of my electrical cooperative, and they have been a very reliable partner. But if this becomes untenable, or if there are too many interruptions, I'll ask Johannes to kindly, deliver my portion. We've been great partners for a long time here. Let me switch into presentation mode if I could. Give me just a moment here. There we go. How's that coming through for everyone? All right.
Good. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, sure. So I can't believe Johannes made a shameless plug. I've never heard him do that before. He's usually a super humble individual, which is something I very much appreciate in him. But I will brag a little bit about the work he just described in the area of the student academic performance gap. We all know what the homework gap is, right? It's either students have broadband access at home or they don't. But that had never been quantified in the area of academic performance before. So Johannes and his team right here in Michigan at Michigan State University did the first national study to quantify what that means to academic outcomes. It was groundbreaking work, and it was actually referenced in President Biden's annual economic report earlier this spring. So I'll brag a little bit for him since he might not do that. So now, why are we here? Why is Merit Network here? I'll talk a little bit about Merit in a moment and let you know who we are if you don't happen to know. But Merit's journey in our partnership with Michigan State University and the Quello Center began in 2018 when I was asked to represent the university's interests as the state started to develop its first really significant long-term broadband roadmap plan. And through that work in our road shows, I actually heard about the plight of rural citizens especially, and even urban and metropolitan residents, about how important broadband was and when it was lacking, the problems it caused them. So I came back to Merit and talked to my team. And, Merit is really, I'll call it a business-to-business organization. We provide broadband connectivity to all of the universities in Michigan, most of the community colleges, all of K through 12 in one way or another. And we hadn't really been involved in helping citizens connect in their homes. But hearing the problems on those road shows in 2018, we decided to do something about that and get involved. And I'll describe what that involvement was in a moment. Our work with the Quello Center goes actually back prior to 2018 when we did some wireless research together. And in 2018, Johannes and I co-authored a formal response to the NTIA about the value of crowdsourced and citizen science broadband testing. And around that time, we launched our Michigan Moonshot, which I'll describe a little later. You already heard Johannes talk about this wonderful research and defining what broadband itself means to students and their potential academic success. We actually leveraged that work, and we have surveyed around a quarter of the counties in Michigan through formal engagement with citizens in counties in mapping broadband and taking sentiment surveys. And finally, why we're here today to really convey, what we're really here to convey to you today is we have an infrastructure artifact of our moonshot work, and that is called Moonlight. And we'll talk about that near the end of the presentation. But I would like you to take a look at this map. It replicates some of what Eric showed you, some of what Johannes showed you in the area of poor broadband. All the shades of red on this screen unfortunately depict where broadband is lacking. And what's really awful is this data, and all the data we've showed, all three of us, I believe, to this point, represent how broadband fares using the old national standard at the beginning of this year, which is 25.3. And as Eric has mentioned, the federal government has upped that standard by around a factor of 4. So this map today, if we were to actually survey how citizen broadband is working, is much redder, and that's not a good thing. But those little blue dots on the screen reflect this new Moonlight project that Merit and Michigan State University were privileged to be awarded by the NTIA, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And how's my audio? Is it coming through okay still? Great. Thank you. I see a thumbs up there. Thanks, Johannes. So who is Merit? Merit is the longest running research and education network in the country. There are around 40 or so organizations like us in many states. Some small states band together, hence there being less than 50 of us. As I mentioned, we connect many, many educational organizations. We're the single ISP for the universities in Michigan. We competitively won the the high capacity network contract for all of K through 12, connecting all of the intermediate school districts across the state. And typically we serve libraries, governments, healthcare, and nonprofits. We are an independent nonprofit. Some people think of us as a government network. We are not a government network. We're actually a fully independent nonprofit 501c3 who happens to be governed by the public universities in Michigan. Our mission is pretty simple. We have a triad strategy. We do networking, cybersecurity, and community building in the area of technology, and especially networking and security. To give you a little background about Merit, again, Merit was formed in 1966. That was an effort that was funded by the National Science Foundation, the universities of Michigan, and the state of Michigan helped launch us as a shared service organization. And we're the oldest and longest running network in the country in this realm. A little fact that I like to convey to people is that in 1987, Merit competitively won an NSF RFP opportunity to run what was then called the National Science Foundation Network. And we ran that from the late 80s into the early 90s. And you now know that little thing is the global internet. So when you ask, what have universities and nonprofits done for us in the country and in Michigan, the internet was part of that work. And I like to joke that we were right there alongside Al Gore at the advent of the internet. Fast forward to 2010 and 2011, Merit won 2 federal grants to construct over 2,200 miles of our own fiber. Merit is unique in the country amongst the research and education networks in that we own and operate much of our own fiber optic infrastructure. So we're rolling trucks just about every day. When backhoes and squirrels that are chewing on fiber cause problems, we're out there fixing it with our crews and our partners. That's important because if you look at this map, and no Merit presentation is complete without showing a map that we're very proud of, we have a sprawling owned infrastructure that actually covers most counties in Michigan and goes around the horn around Lake Michigan to make sure we can provide resiliency if we have a backbone cut. This map does not represent all of Merit's network infrastructure. We have a lot of stubs and stars hanging off this backbone, but it's something we're very proud of. And it's took a long time to build. It is the envy of some of our telecommunication partners in Michigan. I mentioned that back in 2018, we launched this Michigan Moonshot program to try to find a way to have Merit help citizens have better residential and business connectivity. We will never be a residential service provider. We'll always serve our nonprofit community, but we thought there were certainly ways we could help Michigan do better in the area of broadband. And it was sort of like Gretzky skating to where the puck was going to be, although I will say it's a little bit of serendipity as well, because the pandemic started in 2020, as you well know, and this problem was amplified quite significantly. So what our Moonshot program consisted of is data and mapping. We engage with counties and groups of counties and townships to actually help citizens map their broadband, do speed tests, and get sentiment about how it's working for them. We started to educate, we've educated thousands of decision makers in Michigan in how to approach broadband projects, whether it's working with commercial providers or working with municipal owned networks or other cooperative solutions. So we've been educating the Michigan community in a whole range of how to approach improving broadband for their citizens. And as I mentioned, the most recent artifact of the Moonshot program is our Moonlight project, which I'll describe at the end of this presentation. So you can see here, we've been doing a lot of work. It stemmed and originated with our partnership with Quello in 3 rural intermediate school districts across Michigan, where we did the student academic performance gap study. We used a very similar technique, and you can see we've moved that study out across these counties and groups of counties. I'm proud to say that our first customer, Washtenaw County, has gone all the way forward to spending some of their post-COVID grant money to connect every citizen in their county with fiber optic network. And we were very proud to be a part of them, a part of their projects, the early stages of their work. Whoops. I did want to mention that Merit also does its own independent research. We have a lot of federally funded projects, many in the area of cybersecurity and deep science-based network research. We have a lot of funding from the Department of Homeland Security for that work, but we've just spun off and built up a new area of research, and that is meant to really focus on this area of broadband expansion in Michigan and how it benefits society. And Pierrette Dagg was just assigned a new role as our research scientist in that area. So I have to let you know we've been inspired by the Quello Center in that regard. I mentioned that our Michigan Moonshot pillars started out as data and mapping, funding and policy, and education. And now we have our first infrastructure component of that project, and that is called Project Moonlight. And that is actually a partnership with Michigan State University. Yeah, they have been just such wonderful, wonderful partners of Merit. And I'm so pleased that we found sort of this powerhouse combo that is going to be, I think, one of the secret weapons in Michigan to solve the broadband problem. So Project Moonlight is going to create one of the first of its kind infrastructures in the country. It's called the Michigan Open Optical Network. And essentially, we are going to open up our high performance middle mile network at those 103 co-location facilities, those little blue dots that I described at the beginning of the presentation, all across Michigan. And we're going to allow private providers, nonprofit providers to actually build to those locations. And there we're going to provide them high capacity internet by taking them all the way to places like Chicago and other internet exchanges, so that residents and students and teachers and others in every area of Michigan, even in the northern reaches, will have the same internet connectivity as those in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. Moonlight was partially funded by the NTIA with a $10.5 million grant to Michigan State University and Merit. The project is actually about $23 million, so we put some of our own skin in that game to make that network happen. Our goal is to improve broadband access for underserved communities. And the cool thing for Merit is it actually supports our research scientists across the state too. So when you think about our mission being education and research, we feel that homes are the new classrooms, telemedicine facilities, and offices of the 21st century. And we're delighted to be a part of this ecosystem to help continue to serve those needs. I've described our open access middle mile network all across the state as a digital Autobahn. I had to use an automotive analogy, of course, we are Michigan, but it really does describe the project pretty well for the layperson. We essentially are going to take traffic from any one of those 103 facilities across Michigan and deliver high-speed internet to other providers who will work on their own last mile projects in local communities. And we'll do that hopefully at a very competitive cost, even where competition doesn't exist, and sometimes where the service doesn't exist across the state. We're calling those 103 co-location facilities Merit Open Access Exchange Connectors. And in this way, we will bring faster internet to communities that are far afield. This project will serve ISPs and community networks by taking the burden off them of getting to high capacity internet exchanges in big cities and hopefully lower their costs. I like to say that we're trying to lower their costs and accelerate their projects, mostly for the benefit of Michigan citizens. And we believe this is a really exemplar public-private partnership model. And we're hoping that we can again be an asset to the MyHigh office in Michigan. And we already have letters of support from commercial ISPs, several who have projects that are funded through their own venture capital or other federal programs have written letters of support to the federal government for our project. So this is really, you know, an area where we're looking to work together with other providers, commercial and nonprofit. And our goals, the benefit for Michigan and the goals we have are to improve the business cases in these local communities for their last mile internet service provider projects. We'd like to provide better, higher quality connectivity for anchor institutions, schools, libraries, healthcare at the same time. As Johannes mentioned, we think by providing higher connectivity options in rural communities will future-proof the network and prepare for that next round of future applications that he nicely described earlier. Many studies show that high-speed connectivity is not only associated with better academic performance, but with job growth, higher income, higher business startup, and higher property values. So we think there's tremendous number of benefits to be brought to the state here. And I'll just wrap this up by saying that, I heard a very smart person once say that broadband cannot alone solve all the grand challenges of society, but without broadband, you can't solve any of them. So we're really hoping that we can bring all of these secret weapons to bear for the citizens of Michigan. And again, I'd like to thank IPPSR, the Quello Center, and the MyHigh office for a great partnership and the opportunity to present today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe and Johannes. Greatly appreciate your efforts along with those of Eric and Joe. Couldn't agree with you more. I've been working broadband issues for a better part of a decade and a half now, almost 2 decades, and truly believe it should be considered a public utility. Very necessary in the 21st century for economic vitality, economic prosperity for individuals and companies and everyone. So greatly appreciate your work. We still have a couple of questions that I'll get to. And again, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. And Eric, appreciate you sticking around. I think this next one might be for you. When will the broadband infrastructure audit be completed and available to communities and ISPs, including how this timing relates to the application window for Robin? Put another way, will the audit data be available well before the Robin grant submission deadline?
So to answer the last part first, we are trying to do that. So the infrastructure audit is likely going to be done in early December, and that's about the same time that the application window, I'm aiming to have that open for the Robin program. Broadband mapping is fundamentally changing across the nation right now. So there's this odd spot of flux between what states are doing, what the feds are doing, and then having states be able to challenge the new, we didn't talk about challenges, but the new FCC map is going to be coming out here around Thanksgiving time, which will then give states an opportunity to make sure that that federal map accurately reflects the connectivity reality on the ground. And that's what that infrastructure audit data is primarily for, but also it's a myriad of other uses in helping make good decisions about where infrastructure needs to go and where it's not. So the short answer is we're working to get both that audit finished in early December, as well as open up the application window for Robin about the same time, and then use that information in a myriad of other ways to make sure, again, that that federal map accurately reflects what's going on in Michigan.
Yeah, and Eric, to dig a little bit deeper, I mean, there have been questions for some time about the federal map, its accuracy, information that's provided to them by the telcos. So this isn't the first time we've tried to get a proper audit done. Is that right?
So it is the first time at this scale. So the FC, let me see how high level I can go without getting too into the weeds, but the way the FCC map is changing is it's going from mapping broadband based on census blocks, which we know in rural areas get huge, to actual serviceable locations. So the FCC has created what's called a serviceable location fabric. And that's essentially a map of every household, business, and institution across the country that needs broadband service, the actual physical point location of those structures. And so they are using that fabric as a way to map broadband service availability, again, as reported by internet service providers. And so this is the first time that they've done this type of methodology. This scale of granularity is going to be, provide much, much greater information as long as it's accurate. And so what's going to happen is the FCC is going to publish this new map with location-based information, no census blocks, no city blocks, actual location points around Thanksgiving time. We expect there to be errors. It's a brand new methodology. There's lots of data to collect. There's even providers that had never had to submit data before now have to. And so there's going to be some kinks to work out with that map when it's published. But for the first time, the FCC then is going to kick off a challenge process to that map once it's published, where states, communities, the general public, other internet service providers can challenge the availability shown on that map by the internet service providers who have provided it. And that is really, really key, because the FCC map is what the NTIA is going to be using to determine every state's allocation in the BEAD program. So remember before I mentioned that the BEAD program allocation is not yet known for Michigan or any other state, and that's because that FCC map hasn't been published and the challenge process hasn't happened yet. The NTIA has stated that they're going to wait until early next year to make those allocation decisions to allow the challenge process to play out. And so what that means for Michigan is that because we've gone out and started to collect the actual location of infrastructure assets in the field in areas where we think the map has been most overstated in the past and could be most likely to be overstated in the future on this new map, we are going to know where that infrastructure is and is not. And so if there's claims of internet service in areas where we did not find any infrastructure, we'll have definitive proof that that infrastructure obviously cannot serve those locations and they should be considered unserved instead. And so that's going to help make sure that that federal map accurately reflects the connectivity on the ground in Michigan, and therefore gets us our fair share of allocation in that BEAD program going forward.
Sounds like we're building the plane as we fly it, as they say a little bit here, and appreciate your efforts. Another question, how can I steer communities and providers I work with toward the Robin program, BEAD program, and state digital equity planning grants?
That's a good question. That's one thing that we are working on right now is updating the MyHigh website, getting our newsletter up and running. And so we will have a place for all of that information once it gets up and running. So like I said before, one of the things we're doing is kind of hurry up and waiting for our federal funding to come so we can start implementing a lot of these different pieces and parts that we need to. So the MyHigh website will be the place with all of this information. And we have a meeting tomorrow with our internal communications team to get that up and running. So stay tuned for now, but that will be the primary source for information from our office.
I have a question regarding utility and municipal networks for anyone who'd like to take a shot of it. How does Michigan compare to use of utility and municipal owned networks for broadband access compared to other states, and how can it be used as a tool to address the lack of high-speed connectivity in the state?
I'll take that one first, and then Joe and Johannes, if you've got comments too. So we do have a number of municipal and utility-owned ISPs in Michigan, and most notably, rural electric cooperatives have started entering the broadband space in a very big way in the last several years. And because they primarily serve rural places, we have many rural parts of Michigan that are now being served with gigabit level fiber. I think Joe, you mentioned you have TrueStream up where you're at. That's one example, and there's certainly many others. But in Michigan, we don't have an outright ban on municipal broadband like many other states. We certainly have speed bumps in our legislation to municipal broadband, but there have been some really creative projects over the last several years that have brought connectivity to places that have just not had it. And so when I talk about creativity, I think those are some of the options we need to explore. The BEAD program is going to be open to eligible entities types of every variety. And so by bringing all of those tools in our toolbox together, that's the only way we're going to start to become creative with how we can efficiently implement those funds to solve our connectivity challenges.
Yeah, speed bumps might be a polite way of saying it, but as you know, we've come up with some creative solutions. Joe, Johannes, anything to add?
Well, I can just add a couple of thoughts. I don't have sort of statewide comparative data that would compare Michigan and other states. but let me give you a generic answer. I think historically and in the recent past, nonprofits, cooperatives have been really important instruments in bringing broadband to more people. And but they face the same business challenges that private providers face, right? Because the cost structure of serving rural areas is essentially the same for both types of providers. Now, they may be able to use economies of scale and scope if there's already an electrical infrastructure in place, or ducts and other rights of way in place. Nonetheless, I think there's not one solution that fits every single place. And I think in some places, public municipal solutions will be beneficial. They offer different potential benefits in the sense that those often are networks that are open access. There's sort of wholesale networks that provide more innovation opportunities for players in the higher levels of the internet stack, right? Service providers and application providers. And that can have many benefits. But it's not a solution that fits every single place. I think the best strategy for the state actually would be to remove those obstacles, those bumps, as we refer to, right? And say, let's have a more open framework where we can pick the organizational form of providing broadband that fits this best. And also, I mean, you mentioned before public utilities, and I think that's a term that has many connotations with it, right? I mean, if it's public utilities in the sense of we want to reintroduce rate of return regulation, like in the old telephone days, all my red flags go off. I think that's a model that has worked well in some ways, and then it has not worked in many other ways. And the technology, the dynamics of the technology is different. But I think we need to pick the best of experiences from that model, right, and combine it with the current responsibility of technology. So if there were like a modern 21st century notion of a public utility, I would be all for it. But we're still working on this one, I think.
Yeah, well, we still have, we've got great examples, of course, of public utility regulation over the last century. But as you noted, there is an important place for municipal-owned cooperatives and municipal-owned utilities within this discipline, within this genre as well.
Arnold, could I have one comment here?
Absolutely, Joe.
Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but Eric and Johannes both described all of these wonderful types of organizations and solutions we have across the state, and this is a policy forum. So I'll mention one aspect of policy, and that is, even though we have all of these capable organizations, our public policy doesn't always allow others to participate. And I'll reference specifically Public Act 224 of 2020, called the Broadband Expansion Act, which explicitly excludes government-owned or government entities, educational organizations, and their affiliates from receiving state broadband grants. And I just have to laugh. We have all of these capabilities, yet our policy for this policy forum is restricting and constraining this superset of potential solutions. And I think we need to stop that silliness. And I don't know that old law will guide programs going forward, but it shouldn't.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
Yeah,
statement.
that's a good point. Yeah, those specific funds, like the Tech Commission Communities Grant Program that enabled that program, and then even the new Robin program that we're standing up, there were restrictions on who can apply for those funds. However, the BEAD program, again, that largest pot of funding, the bipartisan infrastructure law is very clear that all of those entity types must be able to participate. And so that's why, finding a policy vehicle to implement those funds in the future is where we're going to have to find the best way to do that, because the law is very clear at the federal level that to use those funds, all those entity types need to be able to participate. And thankfully.
Well, we're running past our time now, and so I want to thank again Eric, Joe, and Johannes for their time today in going over opportunities that present itself to the state in the areas of broadband access and expansion and equity issues. Thank you all for your work in this particular area. It's important for continued economic prosperity in Michigan. I want to thank our attendees as well, and let you all know that PowerPoint presentations and a recording will be available within the next day or so. Thanks everyone for joining, and see you next month for another IPPSR Public Policy Forum.
Thank you. Thank you all.